Hello, survivors. Before we dive into today's story, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe. Let's grow our community together. My name is Paul Coffey. Convicted, sentenced. I was wrongfully sentenced to death row a few years ago, but nobody believed me. Who would? I didn't have a clean record, but I shouldn't have been there. Today was supposed to be my last day on Earth. Lethal injection, 3:00 p.m. sharp. I spent my morning like every other inmate on death row, staring at the same concrete walls, waiting. The priest came. The warden came. The guards were cold, detached, routine. My last meal was a hamburger with fries and a Coke. It reminded me of Saturday afternoons with my brother and nephews. I missed them. They didn't come today. Nobody from my family did. They'd said their goodbyes weeks ago, unable to face watching me die. I don't blame them. Without much ceremony, I was escorted to the execution chamber. The sterile room smelled of disinfectant and fear. Through the reinforced glass window, I could see the viewing room filling with witnesses. My lawyer, Patricia Wetmore, sat in the front row, her face pale and resigned. Behind her, members of the victim's family, the family of the 3 people I allegedly murdered. Rebecca, the sister, couldn't look at me. An older man I recognized as the father kept his hands clenched in his lap. A few other observers, maybe reporters or state officials, filled the remaining seats. The guard, Officer Owell, began securing me to the gurney. "Left arm first," he muttered, avoiding eye contact as he tightened the leather restraint around my wrist. The IV port was already in place, ready for the deadly cocktail that would stop my heart. "Where's Dr. Fleming?" Owell asked into his radio. Static crackled back. "Medical examiner's been called to the infirmary," came the response. "Some kind of incident. Give us a few minutes." Owell glanced at the clock on the wall, looking uncomfortable with the delay, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Stay put," he told me, as if I had a choice with one arm already strapped down. "This won't take long." He stepped out of the chamber, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the weight of 20 pairs of eyes watching from behind the glass. The silence stretched as minutes passed. I could see Patricia checking her watch, frowning. The victim's family looked confused. Even the reporters seemed restless. Something changed in the viewing room. A woman in the back row suddenly stood up, swaying slightly. I couldn't hear anything through the soundproof glass, but I could see her mouth moving, saying something to the man next to her. Then she collapsed. Not the graceful fainting you see in movies. She went down hard, her head striking the floor with a sickening thud that I felt more than heard. The man next to her immediately bent down to help, but something was wrong with the way she moved when she tried to get up. Her limbs seemed disconnected. The man who'd been helping her suddenly jerked backward, and I saw bright red spreading across his shirt. Rebecca screamed. I could see her mouth open wide, though I heard nothing. Chaos erupted in the viewing room. People were scrambling over chairs, trying to get away from something I couldn't quite make out. Then I saw the woman clearly. She was on her feet again, but wrong, so terribly wrong. Her face was a mask of blood, her eyes vacant yet somehow focused on the people around her. She moved toward another witness, and I watched in horror as she lunged forward with her mouth open wide. The viewing room door burst open, and I could hear distant shouts and screams now. More people poured into the small space, but these newcomers weren't helping. They were attacking. Officer Owell burst back into the execution chamber, his face pale and his radio crackling with panicked voices. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, staring through the window at the carnage. "What the hell is happening out there?" Before I could answer, Dr. Fleming stumbled through the side entrance that led from the medical prep area. But something was wrong with him too. His usually pristine white coat was torn and stained with something dark. His left arm hung at an odd angle, and when he turned toward us, I saw that half his face was a mess of torn flesh and congealed blood. "Doc," Owell said, taking a step back. "What happened to you?" Dr. Fleming's response was a low, guttural sound that barely seemed human. His eyes, or what remained of them, fixed on Owell with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then he moved, faster than any injured man should be able to move. Owell went for his gun, but Fleming was already on him. They crashed into the medical equipment cart, sending syringes and vials scattering across the floor. I could hear Owell shouting, then screaming as Fleming's teeth found his throat. I was still strapped to the gurney with my left arm, watching this nightmare unfold 3 feet away from me. The restraint was tight, but not impossible to work against. I twisted my wrist, feeling the leather bite into my skin as I tried to slip free. Owell managed to throw Fleming off him and rolled away, blood streaming from his neck. His service weapon had fallen near my gurney, and he crawled toward it, leaving a dark trail behind him. Fleming, seemingly oblivious to the damage Owell had inflicted with his fists and elbows, got back to his feet and stalked forward again. That's when Owell's training kicked in. He grabbed his gun and fired 3 times. The shots were deafening in the small chamber, and I saw Fleming's body jerk with each impact. But he didn't go down. He didn't even slow down. What the? Owell fired again, this time aiming higher. The 4th shot caught Fleming in the forehead, and finally, mercifully, he collapsed. The sudden silence was almost worse than the gunfire. Owell sat on the floor, breathing hard, one hand pressed to his bleeding neck. Through the window, I could see that the viewing room had become a slaughterhouse. Bodies lay twisted among overturned chairs, and the survivors, if that's what you could call them, moved among the fallen with that same terrible hunger I'd seen in Fleming. "We need to get out of here," I said, still working at my restraint. "Now." Owell looked at me like he'd forgotten I existed. His eyes were wide with shock, but he was still thinking clearly enough to understand our situation. "The others," he said, nodding toward the viewing room. "Some of them might still be." "Look at them," I snapped. "Really look." He did, and I saw his face go even paler. Rebecca was still alive, pressed against the far wall, but she was trapped. 3 of those things, I couldn't think of them as people anymore, had her cornered. She was holding a chair in front of her like a shield, but it was only a matter of time. Owell made a decision. He shot out the reinforced glass window. The first shot spiderwebbed the surface. The second opened a hole big enough to see through. The third and fourth shots widened it enough for a person to climb through, though jagged edges remained around the frame. "Can you get free?" he asked me. I'd been working at the restraint throughout the chaos, and the leather had stretched just enough. With one final twist that left my wrist raw and bleeding, I slipped out. Owell was already climbing through the broken window, gun drawn. I followed, careful to avoid the worst of the glass shards. The viewing room reeked of blood and something else, something rotten and wrong that caught in the back of my throat. Rebecca saw us coming and cried out in relief. One of the creatures turned toward the sound, giving Owell a clear shot. He put it down with a single bullet to the head, and the thing dropped instantly. "Headshots," he muttered. "Only headshots work." The other 2 were still focused on Rebecca, driven by whatever instinct had replaced their humanity. Owell dispatched them both with clinical efficiency, though I could see his hands shaking. "Thank you," Rebecca gasped, dropping the chair. Her composure was completely gone, replaced by raw terror. "Thank you, I thought, we need to move." Owell cut her off. "This is spreading." I looked around the viewing room and counted several bodies that weren't moving, including Patricia. Among the dead, I recognized Rebecca's father, his throat torn open. But then I saw movement from another corner. One of the reporters was starting to twitch, his body beginning to convulse slightly. "Oh well," I said quietly. "They're not staying dead." He followed my gaze and saw what I was seeing. The reporter's eyes opened, but they were wrong, clouded and vacant, yet somehow focused. He began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing coordination. "How long?" Owell asked. "Since he died?" "Maybe 2 minutes." Owell raised his weapon and took the shot. The reporter dropped and didn't get back up. "We can't stay here," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If this is spreading..." She was right, but I was thinking about something else. In all the chaos, I'd noticed something important about these things. They were fast when they needed to be, but they weren't smart. They reacted to movement and sound, but they didn't plan or problem solve. When Owell had shot out the window, they hadn't turned toward the noise. They'd stayed focused on their immediate target. "They hunt by instinct," I said. Sight, sound, probably smell, but they're not thinking. What are you saying? Owell asked. I'm saying if we're quiet and careful, we might be able to get past them, but first we need to figure out how far this has spread. From somewhere in the prison beyond the execution wing, we could hear distant screams and the occasional gunshot. Whatever had happened here was happening throughout the facility. Owell checked his ammunition. Half a clip left. Not enough if we run into a crowd of these things. I looked at the chaos around us, at Rebecca's terrified face, at the bodies that might not stay down. Minutes ago, I'd been waiting to die. Now I was the only one in this room who'd spent years thinking about survival in a hostile environment. I know this place better than anyone, I said. The guard routes, the blind spots, the emergency exits. If you want to get out alive, you're going to need me. Owell stared at me for a long moment, a convicted killer offering to lead them to safety. But the sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor made the decision for him. Lead the way, he said. The execution chamber had 2 exits. The main door led back toward the general prison population, but that route would take us through the administrative areas where I could already hear chaos spreading. The other exit was a service corridor that maintenance used to access the electrical and ventilation systems. It wasn't meant for prisoners, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Service corridor, I said, pointing to the unmarked door beside the medical equipment. It connects to the old section of the prison. Fewer people means fewer of those things. Owell nodded, checking his radio one more time. Nothing but static and the occasional scream. Whatever communication network the prison had was falling apart fast. Rebecca stayed close behind us as we approached the service door. Her hands were shaking, and I could see she was fighting to hold herself together. She'd just watched her father die and turn into something that wasn't human anymore. The trauma was written all over her face, but she was still moving, still thinking. That counted for something. The service corridor was narrow and dimly lit, with exposed pipes running along the ceiling and electrical conduits mounted on the walls. The air was stale and carried the distant sound of ventilation fans that might not be running much longer if the power grid failed. Our footsteps were muffled by years of dust and grime on the concrete floor. "How do you know about this place?" Rebecca whispered, the first word she'd spoken since we'd started moving. 5 years on death row gives you time to memorize every inch of this place, I said. Guard rotations, shift changes, maintenance schedules. When you're planning an escape that'll never happen, you learn everything. "Were you really going to try to escape?" Owell asked, keeping his voice low. "Every day," I admitted, even knowing I'd never make it past the first checkpoint. It was the only thing that kept me sane. We reached an intersection where the corridor branched in 3 directions. To the left was the old cell block that had been abandoned after a fire 10 years ago. Straight ahead led to the kitchen and laundry facilities. To the right was the route toward the main entrance and visitor processing. I held up my hand, listening. From the left came nothing but silence. Too much silence. From straight ahead came the sound of breaking glass and what might have been screaming. From the right came footsteps, but they were wrong. Too irregular, too desperate. Left, I decided. The old cell block is our best bet. "What if there are people trapped in there?" Rebecca asked. "Then we help them if we can," Owell said, "but we don't die trying." The old cell block smelled like ash and neglect. The fire had damaged most of the electrical systems, leaving this section in perpetual twilight. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows that made everything look threatening. Our footsteps echoed despite our efforts to move quietly. We were halfway through the cell block when we heard it, a low moaning sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was the same sound Dr. Fleming had made, but multiplied. There were more of them somewhere nearby. "How many?" Owell whispered, raising his weapon. I counted the sounds, trying to separate individual voices from the collective moan. "At least 6, maybe more." "Can we go around them?" I thought about the layout. The old cell block had been designed as a straight corridor with cells on both sides. There was an emergency exit at the far end, but it would take us past whatever was making those sounds. "There's a maintenance shaft about 50 feet ahead," I said. "It connects to the heating system. We could crawl through it and come out in the next section." "How big is this shaft?" Rebecca asked, clearly not liking the idea. Big enough barely, but it beats walking into a crowd of zombies. The word slipped out before I could stop it. Zombies. That's what they were, even though my rational mind wanted to find some other explanation. Dr. Fleming had been dead. I'd watched Owell put a bullet through his brain. But before that, he'd been moving and attacking with no signs of consciousness or pain. These weren't sick people or drugged inmates. They were something else entirely. We found the maintenance shaft behind a grated panel that took precious minutes to remove with the limited tools we had. The opening was barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, and completely dark beyond the first few feet. "I'll go first," I said. "If something goes wrong, you two get out of here." "No," Owell said firmly. "I've got the gun and the training. I go first. This is my prison. I know where we're going." We were wasting time arguing, and the moaning sounds were getting closer. Rebecca settled the argument by dropping to her knees and starting to crawl into the shaft. "I'm smallest," she said. "If I get stuck, you'll know it won't work." Owell cursed under his breath but didn't stop her. We could hear her moving through the metal ductwork, the sound echoing strangely in the confined space. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we heard her voice from somewhere ahead. "It opens up," she called softly. "There's a room with machinery." Owell went next, his equipment belt scraping against the metal walls. I followed last, pulling the grate back into place behind us. It wouldn't stop anything, but it might buy us a few seconds if we were being followed. The machinery room was part of the prison's heating system, filled with massive boilers that hadn't been used since the renovation 5 years ago. Rebecca was standing near a window that looked out into what had once been the prison yard. What we saw through that window changed everything. The yard was full of people, but they weren't people anymore. Dozens of them wandered aimlessly between the buildings. Some wore prison uniforms, others were clearly guards or staff. A few looked like they might have been visitors still dressed in civilian clothes, but it was the bodies scattered across the yard that told the real story. The infection, or whatever this was, had spread fast, faster than anyone could have anticipated. The prison's population was around 2,000 inmates plus several hundred staff. If even half of them had been affected, we were looking at more infected than the three of us could possibly handle. "Jesus," Owell breathed, staring out at the chaos. "How did this happen so fast?" "Look at them," I said, pointing to a group near the main building. "They're not aimless, they're following something." He was right. A cluster of the infected were all moving in the same direction, toward the visitor processing center. As we watched, more joined them, drawn by some stimulus we couldn't identify. "Sound," Rebecca said suddenly. "They're following sound." From the direction they were moving came the faint sound of a phone ringing. Someone was still alive in that building, and their phone was drawing every zombie in hearing range directly to them. "We have to help them," Rebecca said. "We have to stay alive," Owell countered. 3 people can't fight through that many of those things." I was thinking about something else. The visitor processing center was connected to the main entrance, our best route out of the prison, but it was also clearly compromised now. We needed another way out, and I was running out of options I knew would work. "The main gate," I said suddenly. "What about it?" Owell asked. "It's the most heavily fortified exit, but it's also designed to keep people in, not out. If we can get to the guard towers, we might be able to override the security systems and open the gates." "And you know this how?" "Because I spent 5 years studying every weakness in this place," I admitted. "The guard towers have manual overrides for the main gate. It's a failsafe in case of power outages." "Where are these towers?" Rebecca asked. "2 of them flank the main entrance, but we'd have to cross the yard to get there, and you saw what's out there." Owell considered this, watching the infected swarm toward the visitor center. "Any other options?" "The loading dock behind the kitchen. Supply trucks come in there, less secure than the main gate, but also less likely to be swarming with those things." Rebecca was still staring out at the chaos, her face pale. "What about the people in that building? We can't just leave them. If we try to save them, we'll end up like them," I said. I know that sounds cold, but it's the truth. Those things out there don't get tired, they don't feel pain, and they don't stop. The only reason we're still alive is because we haven't given them a reason to notice us. As if to prove my point, the phone in the visitor center stopped ringing. The sudden silence was deafening, and we watched as the swarm of infected milled around the building entrance, confused by the loss of their auditory beacon. "They're still there," Rebecca whispered. "The people inside." "Maybe," Owell said. "Or maybe the phone just ran out of battery. We couldn't stay in the machinery room forever." The infection was spreading throughout the prison, and it was only a matter of time before the infected found us. Our escape routes meant navigating through the main prison areas, but that was our only choice now. "There's a covered walkway that connects this building to the main corridor," I said. "From there we can decide between the guard towers or the loading dock. If we're careful, we can make it without being spotted." "And if we're not careful?" Rebecca asked. "Then we find out how fast we can run." And that's how Paul Coffey, minutes past his scheduled execution, became the guide for the living in a world rapidly filling with the dead. The covered walkway stretched ahead of us like a tunnel leading into hell. Through the reinforced windows, we could see infected wandering the main corridor beyond, their movements jerky and wrong. Some wore prison uniforms, others guard gear. "Loading dock," Owell decided after watching the chaos. The guard towers would put us right in the middle of that swarm. I nodded, though part of me wondered if we were just delaying the inevitable. The loading dock was on the far side of the prison complex, which meant navigating through the kitchen, the general population areas, and God knew what else. "Stay close," I whispered as we reached the end of the walkway. "And whatever happens, don't run unless I say so. Running draws them like moths to flame." The main corridor was a nightmare. Bodies littered the floor, some clearly dead, others twitching as they began the transformation we'd witnessed. The smell was overwhelming. Blood, fear, and something else that made my stomach turn. The emergency lighting cast everything in a sickly red glow. We moved single file along the wall, stepping carefully around the debris. An infected guard stumbled past us, focused on something ahead. His face was a ruin of torn flesh, but he paid us no attention. Whatever drove these things, we weren't triggering it as long as we stayed quiet. The kitchen entrance was blocked by an overturned food cart, but there was enough space to squeeze through. Inside, the industrial space looked like a war zone. Pots and pans scattered everywhere. Food splattered across the walls, and in the corner 3 figures hunched over something that had once been human. "Jesus," Rebecca breathed, then immediately covered her mouth. The sound was barely audible, but one of the infected looked up. Its face was a mess of blood and torn flesh, and when it saw us, it let out a low moan that made my skin crawl. The other 2 turned as well, rising from their meal with predatory focus. "Back out," Owell whispered, raising his weapon. Slowly, we retreated toward the entrance, but more infected were filtering into the corridor behind us. We were trapped between 2 groups, with nowhere to run. That's when we heard the voice. Well, look what we have here." A man emerged from behind one of the industrial freezers, moving with the fluid confidence of someone completely at ease with violence. He was tall and lean, with the kind of scars that spoke of serious prison time. Most unsettling were his eyes, bright and intelligent, but with something fundamentally wrong behind them. "Tommy Briggs," I said, recognizing him immediately. "What are you doing out of solitary?" Tommy grinned, showing teeth filed to points, a modification he'd given himself during his last stint in isolation. "Funny thing about apocalypses, Paul. All the doors just sort of open up." He was holding what looked like a makeshift flamethrower, a cleaning spray bottle connected to a lighter with electrical tape. In his other hand was a butcher knife from the kitchen. "These dead folks," he continued, gesturing at the infected, "they're not much for conversation, but they burn real nice." One of the kitchen infected lurched toward us, and Tommy casually sprayed it with his improvised weapon. The thing went up like a torch, stumbling around and spreading fire to anything it touched. "Problem solved," Tommy said with satisfaction. "You're going to burn the whole place down," Owell snapped. "Maybe that's the idea, officer." Tommy's grin widened. Been wanting to redecorate this place for years. The infected guard we'd passed earlier had heard the commotion and was shambling back toward us. More were appearing at both ends of the corridor. We needed to move, but Tommy was blocking our path to the loading dock. "We need to get out of here," I said. "All of us." "Oh, I'm not going anywhere," Tommy replied. "This is the most fun I've had since they locked me up. But you three, you're welcome to stay and watch the show." He sprayed another infected, and this one crashed into a stack of cardboard boxes that immediately caught fire. The smoke was getting thick, and I could hear more of those things being drawn by the noise and the smell. "You're insane," Rebecca said. "Guilty as charged, sweetheart." Tommy winked at her. "But sanity's overrated when the world's ending." Owell was calculating angles, trying to figure out how to get past Tommy without getting roasted. The man was clearly unhinged, but he was also the only thing standing between us and a growing crowd of infected. "Look," I said, trying to reason with him. "Whatever grudge you have with this place, it's over now. The whole system's collapsed. You win." "Do I?" Tommy cocked his head like a curious bird. "Because from where I'm standing, you're still giving orders and I'm still taking them. Doesn't feel much like winning." He had a point, twisted as it was. Tommy Briggs had spent the last 8 years in various forms of isolation after attacking 3 guards and 2 inmates. The man was a predator who'd found his perfect hunting ground. "What do you want?" Owell asked, his hand inching toward his weapon. "I want to watch it all burn," Tommy said simply, "starting with you 3. He raised the flamethrower, but Rebecca moved faster than any of us expected. She grabbed a heavy soup ladle from the floor and hurled it at Tommy's improvised weapon. The impact knocked it from his hands, sending burning liquid splashing across the floor. "Run!" she shouted. We bolted toward the loading dock entrance as Tommy dove for his dropped weapon. Behind us, the kitchen was becoming an inferno, and the smoke was drawing infected from throughout the prison. The fire alarm system was still working, adding its shrill wail to the chaos. The loading dock was in the basement level, accessible through a service elevator or a narrow staircase. The elevator was obviously out of the question, too noisy, too risky. We took the stairs 3 at a time, our footsteps echoing in the concrete stairwell. "Is he following us?" Rebecca gasped as we reached the bottom. I looked back up the stairwell. No sign of Tommy, but I could hear him laughing maniacally somewhere above us. The man was staying with his fire, probably enjoying every moment of the destruction. The loading dock was surprisingly quiet. 2 large bay doors led to the outside world, and between them sat an abandoned delivery truck. More importantly, there were no infected in sight. "Too easy," Owell muttered, checking his weapon. He was down to maybe 6 rounds. He was right to be suspicious. The bay doors were locked with heavy chains and padlocks, standard security measures. We'd need tools to cut through them, and tools meant noise. Noise meant attracting every infected thing in the area. "There," I pointed to a tool cabinet mounted on the wall. "Bolt cutters." The cabinet was locked, but a quick blow from a nearby crowbar took care of that. The bolt cutters were heavy and awkward, but they'd do the job. The question was whether we could work fast enough. "I'll cut, you 2 watch for company," I said. The chain was thick and the cutters were dull, but metal eventually gave way to persistence. Each snap of the links sounded impossibly loud in the enclosed space. Sweat dripped into my eyes as I worked, my hands cramping from the effort. "Company," Rebecca hissed. 3 infected had found their way down the stairs. A guard and 2 inmates, all of them showing the telltale signs of the transformation. They moved slowly but deliberately toward us, drawn by the noise of our escape attempt. Owell took careful aim and put down the guard with a headshot. The sound of the gunfire in the enclosed space was deafening, but it also brought more infected stumbling down the stairs. "How much longer?" he asked, taking down another one. "Almost there." The last few links were giving way, but more infected were appearing. Soon we'd be facing more than Owell could handle with his remaining ammunition. The chain finally parted, and I hauled the bay door open. Cool night air rushed in, carrying the scent of rain and freedom. But what I saw outside made my heart sink. The loading area was swarming with infected. They must have been drawn by the fire alarm and the sound of gunshots. Dozens of them milled around the trucks and loading equipment, and more were arriving every minute. Back door, Rebecca suggested. There was a personnel exit on the side wall, a simple steel door with a push-bar release. It wasn't chained, just locked from the inside, but it led directly into the prison yard, where we'd seen the massive swarm earlier. Either way, we're walking into them, Owell said. I was thinking about our options when I heard a familiar laugh from the stairwell. Tommy Briggs appeared at the bottom of the stairs, his clothes singed and his face streaked with soot. He'd traded his flamethrower for a fire axe, and his grin was wider than ever. "Leaving so soon?" he called out. "But the party's just getting started." Behind him, the stairwell was full of infected drawn by the smoke and fire upstairs. They ignored Tommy completely, focused on us as the nearest source of sound and movement. He's herding them toward us, Owell realized. Tommy was indeed using the infected like weapons, staying just ahead of them and directing their attention toward us. The man had figured out how to control them without becoming a target himself. Side door, I decided. At least in the yard we have room to maneuver. We burst through the personnel exit into the chaos of the prison yard. The fire had spread to multiple buildings, casting everything in a hellish orange glow. Smoke billowed across the compound, reducing visibility to just a few yards. But the fire had also done something unexpected. It had drawn most of the infected toward the burning buildings, leaving sections of the yard relatively clear. We had a narrow window of opportunity. "Guard tower," I pointed toward the nearest one. "We can see the whole compound from there and figure out our next move." The tower was maybe 100 yards away, but it felt like a mile. We moved carefully through the smoke, trying to stay invisible to the scattered infected that wandered through the haze. The heat was intense and the smoke burned our lungs with every breath. We were halfway to the tower when Rebecca grabbed my arm. "Listen," she whispered. In the distance, barely audible over the roar of the flames, came the sound of helicopters, multiple aircraft getting closer. "Military?" Owell suggested hopefully. "Or news crews," I said. "Either way, someone knows what's happening here." The helicopters passed overhead without stopping, but their searchlights briefly illuminated the yard. What we saw in that moment was terrifying. Hundreds of infected wandering through the smoke. More than we'd realized were still mobile. We reached the guard tower without incident, but the door was locked and the windows were too high to reach from the ground. Owell shot the lock off, wincing at the noise it made. Inside, a narrow staircase led up to the observation level. The view from the top was apocalyptic. Half the prison was on fire, and infected wandered everywhere like lost souls. But more disturbing was what lay beyond the prison walls. Fires in the distance, abandoned cars on the highway, and no sign of organized response. Through the tower's mounted binoculars, I could see into the general population cell block across the yard. What I witnessed there made my stomach turn. In one of the common areas, a group of infected inmates were feeding on what remained of a guard. His radio still crackled with desperate calls for backup that would never come. "Jesus Christ," Owell breathed, following my gaze. "Look at Block C." I adjusted the binoculars toward the main cell block. Through broken windows, we could see chaos unfolding in real time. Infected prisoners moved through the corridors, following the sounds of the living. A guard had barricaded himself in a control room, but infected were pounding on the reinforced glass with bloody fists, leaving crimson smears with each impact. "There," Rebecca pointed to another section. "Someone's still alive." In the medical wing, we could see a group of maybe 6 people, staff and inmates together, trapped on the second floor. They'd pushed furniture against the stairway entrance, but infected were climbing over each other, creating human ladders to reach them. The survivors were running out of space. "We have to help them," Rebecca said. "We can't," I replied, though it killed me to say it. "Even if we could get there, we'd just be adding ourselves to the casualty count." As we watched, one of the infected finally broke through their barricade. The group scattered, some jumping from second-story windows to escape. Those who survived the fall were immediately swarmed by infected waiting below. Those who didn't survive the fall got back up within minutes, joining the horde. "How many people were in this place?" Owell asked, his voice hollow. "About 2,500 total," I said. "Inmates, staff, visitors. If even half of them turned." The magnitude of what we were witnessing started to sink in. This wasn't just a prison riot or a medical emergency. This was the complete collapse of civilization, starting from within our most secure facilities and spreading outward. Through the binoculars, I could see more details that painted a grim picture. In the workshops, infected inmates still wore their work coveralls, their hands bloody from clawing at anything that moved. In the cafeteria, bodies lay scattered among overturned tables, some beginning to twitch back to life. But what chilled me most was seeing Warden Thompson's office. The man who'd signed my execution order sat slumped over his desk, clearly dead from massive trauma to his neck and head. As we watched, he began to move, slowly lifting his head to reveal the clouded eyes and slack jaw of the infected. "Even the warden," Owell muttered. "Nobody was safe." The infection had been completely democratic in its spread. Guards and inmates, staff and administrators, all were equally vulnerable, all equally doomed. The hierarchy that had defined prison life for decades meant nothing now. "Look at the medical wing again," Rebecca said, adjusting the binoculars. "Is that smoke?" She was right. Through the windows of the infirmary, we could see orange flames beginning to spread. Either an electrical fire had started from damaged systems, or someone had deliberately set it ablaze. Either way, it would spread quickly through that section of the prison. "The whole place is going to burn," I realized. "Between Tommy's fires and whatever's happening in medical, this entire complex will be gone by morning." "Maybe that's for the best," Owell said quietly. "Nothing good is getting out of here alive." But even as he said it, we could see infected streaming out of various exits. Drawn by sounds and lights beyond the prison walls, they are heading toward the outside world where unsuspecting people waited. "It's not just here," Rebecca said quietly. "This is everywhere." She was right. Whatever had caused the outbreak in the prison had spread far beyond these walls. The helicopters we'd heard were probably fleeing, not responding. We weren't just escaping from prison. We were escaping into a world that had already fallen. "The main gate's clear," Owell observed, pointing to the prison entrance. "Fire drew most of them away." "So we just walk out?" Rebecca asked. "If we can get there without being seen." The gate was maybe 200 yards from our tower, across open ground. But the smoke would provide cover, and most of the infected were clustered around the burning buildings. We made our descent and started across the yard. The smoke was both blessing and curse. It hid us from the infected, but it also hid them from us. More than once, we nearly walked into a wandering zombie before spotting it at the last second. The gate itself was massive, 2 layers of chain link topped with razor wire, with a guard booth in between. The outer gate was already open, probably abandoned when the guards fled. The inner gate required a key card or manual override from the booth. "I'll check the booth," Owell said. The small building was empty except for monitoring equipment and a logbook. Owell found the manual release and triggered it. The inner gate swung open. "Come on," he called. But Rebecca was backing away from the gate, her face pale in the firelight. "I can't," she said. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I can't go with you." She looked directly at me. "You're a convicted killer. Paul, you might be innocent of the crimes they executed you for, but you're still dangerous. I've seen how you think, how you plan. In there, I needed that. Out here." "I saved your life," I said, not believing what I was hearing. "And I'm grateful. But I can't trust you with mine anymore." Owell looked between us, understanding the dilemma. In the chaos of the prison, my knowledge and experience had made me valuable. Out in the world, I was just another threat. "Where will you go?" he asked Rebecca. "My aunt lives about 10 miles from here. If she's still alive, if any place is safe." She shrugged. "It's better than running with a stranger who knows how to kill." I wanted to argue, but I understood her logic. Trust was a luxury none of us could afford anymore. The skills that had kept me alive in prison would serve me well in this new world, but they also made me someone to fear. "Take this," Owell said, offering Rebecca his radio. "It's been mostly static, but you might pick up something useful." She accepted it gratefully, then looked at me one more time. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything, but this is where we part ways." She walked back toward the prison, probably planning to find another exit or wait until the fires died down. I watched her disappear into the smoke, feeling strangely hollow. "She's making a mistake," Owell said. "Maybe, or maybe she's the only one of us thinking clearly." We walked through the main gate and onto the highway beyond. The road was littered with abandoned vehicles, some still smoldering. In the distance, more fires burned against the night sky. Whatever had started in the prison had clearly spread everywhere. "What now?" Owell asked. I thought about my brother and his kids probably somewhere out there in this chaos, not knowing that the world had changed forever. I thought about all the people who'd written me off as a lost cause, who'd watched me sentenced to death without a second thought. "Now I find my family," I said, "before someone else does." The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent 5 years on death row waiting to die for crimes I didn't commit. Now, with actual death stalking the earth, I was finally free to live. The question was whether there'd be anything left to live for. But as we walked away from the burning prison, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. Not the hollow purpose of survival, but the real thing. I had somewhere to go, someone to find, something worth fighting for. The world had ended, but my story was just beginning.